I am Dean Miller, President and CEO of PACT, and really excited for this morning's program and very thankful for so many different organizations that support us as an organization and specifically this Technology Executive Roundtable series. As you know, it is designed for CEOs, CIOs, CTOs, heads of technology to come together, share best practices, learn from one another, and really build community. And as you know, we have an incredible community here of both large companies all the way down to startups and everything in between. We are supported by several organizations and just want to call those out: Amatech, Anexinet, Boomi, Signiti, Comcast Business, Principal, RSM, SAP, Slalom, and Vanguard. And you'll note here that there are certainly a number of large companies involved, but also small and emerging ones. And Boomi, by the way, once upon a time was a startup participating in this very program that's now grown to a multi-billion-dollar company, and certainly look forward to many more like that as well. You know the drill in terms of housekeeping. You are muted, but please ask questions. Use the chat box to do so. Our panelists and our moderator will look at those. They'll respond to those. Our program will last about an hour until 9:35. And then right after the discussion, we'll go into small roundtables, subject-specific roundtables where you'll be able to gather virtually based upon your own interests. You can actually move from table to table as well, but it's an opportunity, again, to have some face-to-face conversation and drill down on a couple of topics. Our speakers today will help lead those discussions. Without further ado, I want to introduce our moderator of this morning's discussion. Rebecca Sundheim is the head of API platforms at Vanguard. Again, a longtime partner and member of the board. Warren Pennington, her colleague, sits on the PAC board. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate being here, Dean. So I'm excited to get started with you all today. For those of you who don't know, I've been at Vanguard for somewhere around the better part of 10 years and just really excited to get a chance to talk to all of you. So let's turn it over to the panel and have them introduce themselves. Why don't we start off with Chris?
Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Cera. I'm the CEO of Arcweb Technologies. We work with growth leaders to build custom digital products. We've been around for over a decade. We're a certified B Corporation. We've won more than five awards in the past year from Fast Company, Mobile Web Awards, and other awards. And we're based in Old City. So thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Bill?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Bill Fraser. I'm the VP of Technology at GS1 US. We are a neutral, not-for-profit identification and standards organization, and we're really best known as the administrator of the UPC barcode and help organizations uniquely identify their products, locations, companies, and then help that data to be shared in a consistent way throughout the supply chain. And I've been in a senior technology leadership role for over 20 years, and I'm excited about today's program.
Thanks, Bill. Bruce?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Bruce Marable, CEO of Employee Cycle. We're an HR analytics platform. And in our HR community, we know every HR leader thinks that HR spreadsheets suck. They're tedious, they're manual, they're time consuming, and they don't allow HR leaders to become as proactive from a data-driven perspective as possible. So that's why we have an HR analytics dashboard with pre-built integration connectors to the most popular HR systems to be able to pull all that data into one source of truth.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys, for introducing yourself. So let's kind of dive in. When we think about the build versus buy topic today, the topic never gets old, whether it's 5 years from now or 3 years ago. Build versus buy is incredibly important for any company and their path forward. And so when we set the scope and we set the stage for this topic today, just kind of want to level set a little bit. I think oftentimes we talk about products for build versus buy, so software, hardware, but I also don't want to limit the scope such that we can't include things like services or talent or even ultimately acquiring companies. All of that is part of build versus buy. So why don't we start off a little bit with what principles and factors do you all think about when you think about a decision around build versus buy, and how do you kind of get started? And maybe let's start with Bruce.
Sure. So just to give you some context, Employee Cycle, we're a startup. We've been around for a couple of years. We're closing now on our seed round. And so from our perspective, we're definitely not thinking about acquiring a company. We're nowhere near ready for that. But when we think of build versus buy, it's really all around, should we have our engineering team spend time, energy, resources on building something that's core to our product, or should we buy something off the shelf? And so the way that I typically think about it from a CEO, but also from a strategic perspective, is really, is the thing that we're building core IP that we need to hold on to so that this will continue to increase the value of our company? Or is it something that's been commoditized that we need to build or buy off the shelf? And so for us, things like billing, there's no way we would buy, just as an easy example, there's no way we would buy a billing system. We're going to use bill.com, or we're going to use Stripe or something else, or accounting software. We're not going to build our own accounting software. Some people do, but there's no way when we could just use QuickBooks. However, for our specific company, where we're all about bringing in data and ingesting that data to be able to transform it into intelligent and actionable insights, for us, that ingester, that ability to be able to pull data from multiple HR systems, that's our core IP, because that's where we actually spend the most of our time. That's where the most value in our business is. And so really, I think about, one, is it core IP to the business? Is it something that we can buy off the shelf? But then the middle gray ground is there an opportunity to buy something off the shelf for the short time as a stopgap to then get to market pretty fast and then build that as core IP later? So I'll stop there.
Hey, Bill, you want to add anything?
Absolutely. So from a core IP and commodity component, I completely agree with everything Bruce said. I think that one of the key components for me is how much can you live inside of the box with what you're looking at? So is it something where you can configure and live inside of the tooling and the solution that you're buying? If it's a software solution, do you need to really customize it for it to be usable in your world? And how willing is the business to actually make the trade-offs that are necessary to live in good enough? Good enough is really critical when you're going to buy software. And when you get into the world of really heavily customizing things, you're probably better off to just build it, because the trade-offs that you're making in that customization really wind up driving the costs of the buy to the point where it's closer to build anyway. And then on the resourcing side, I think it's mostly for me about the skills that you need. Are these skills that you can keep? Are these skills that you can grow? Are these skills that are available? And Rebecca, to your point, about Great Resignation, how sticky can you keep these skills right now? Is it stickier to do it with staff? Is it stickier to do it with contracting and consulting? And how do you best serve the need of what you're looking for? And I'll stop there for now.
Chris?
For product outsourcing, generally speaking, I think you should try to buy something first and move on to bigger business problems. I think it really matters what's most important to your business problem. Is it time? Is it cost? Or is it the functionality that's going to be delivered? And in theory, buying something should improve whatever's more critical in that spectrum of what you prioritize. However, if there's some kind of mismatch, then building might be the way to go, or what you consider. And I agree with what both Bill and Bruce said around strategic and core intellectual property. And you certainly want to put more controls in place for either the buy or build scenario if it touches on those areas. In terms of team outsourcing, so if you're an early stage company or just a growth stage company, and you're thinking about outsourcing some of your product development, I think it really matters who you are as an organization. Are you a product or design-led engineering company? Are you a builder? We often sort of have an archetype of sorts for people that are entrepreneurial builders, and these are people that generally don't outsource anything. And I think if you're an early stage company or you're trying to grow, generally speaking, I feel like you should try to hire employees, give them equity, and run for the races. Entrepreneurs might not have a choice though, and have to outsource some things because it might take you a while to hire that CTO, who then wants to hire a bunch of senior engineers, and then before your team's built, 18 months have gone by. And I've one thing I also want to mention, I've also seen entrepreneurs that have endeavored to build a product and engineering team, and they just don't have the right DNA as a company or as a person to really run those organizations. And then it's really high risk to try to build that type of organization. And so you should outsource it. So those are some of the things that I think about.
So Chris, I think that's a great segue into the next question. Let's talk a little bit about the skills as a leadership team or as a leader that you feel like one needs to kind of make a build versus buy decision. Are there some leaders that are better suited for build than they are for buy? And if so, like what kind of skills do you think differ in those cases?
Well, I think from a product perspective, I mean, most people that come into product management of some kind, a lot of them come from either a design background, an engineering background, or some kind of product-oriented business background. So I think you need that type of leadership on a team in some form or fashion. And sometimes in an early stage company, you'll see, we have another archetype of sorts that we refer to as a product CEO. And these are people that are CEOs of their company that are very product minded. And if you think of like the Steve Jobs type of person, that's essentially a product CEO. So that doesn't have to be the CEO. I mean, this is essentially just the product leader. So you certainly need to have technology leadership, which can be different than product leadership, especially for something that's a very engineering heavy type of product. You want to have end user representation, so strong end user representation and really understanding what the end user needs. And sometimes that can be proxied from a product manager or product CEO, but generally speaking, that's better coming from someone from an operations practice that really feels the pain of the business problem. So you want to have that person on board. And something really strategic, dare I say, you want to have finance people involved too, that have a lot of experience buying and building things. And I think experience with buying and building and running a few races and having them not go well is also part of the good DNA for a team.
Great. Bill, do you want to lean in there?
So I agree with the team makeup that Chris went through. I think that the pieces that are really critical are the trade-offs, as well as the management of the scope and the time and the cost. At the end of the day, that group needs to come together and they need to be aligned. And the way that you do that is by really making sure that they are connected and everyone has a common understanding of what you're going after. What is the business problem that you're solving, and that everybody has a stake in it. If people lean back and say, "Oh, it's this person's problem," they made the decision. I'm not as vested. That's where you're going to run into problems. So I think it's really that team. That team needs to be engaged. They all need to be leaning in. They also all have to have a common understanding of the problem and approach it from that perspective. And as an organization, you have to be willing to make the trade-offs, no matter whether that's in a buy world or whether that's in a build world. There are always trade-offs, and you have to not let perfection stand in the way of something that is good, that for your business, for your company, for your clients. You have to ultimately be able to move, and to do that alignment is critical.
That's totally fair, and I think that's a good segue into kind of the next question. Whenever you think about build versus buy, what are the critical things you feel like you need kind of upfront? What type of information, what type of prep work? Bruce, maybe let's start with you. If it's more helpful, we can shift.
I'm sorry, were you calling me?
Sorry, I called Bruce, but Chris, if you want to step in.
Sorry. I'm sorry, Rebecca. I don't know if that was on my end, but it sounded like you were breaking up.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no worries. And so in regards to the prep work, I think some of this goes back into the previous question as well. And so I really do second everything that Chris and Bill was saying, especially around that part of done is better than perfect. I say that all the time throughout our organization. Every time marketing, sales, product, whatever we're doing, done is always better than perfect because we need to move fast. But from a startup perspective, again, the prep work to me, it's hard to remove the prep work from the whole concept and framework of how you do build. And so really the three things, and I was just taking some notes here, is that ruthless prioritization. Before you start, truly understand what are the things that you absolutely positively need to build in order to test before you build a lot more. Because what I find is that too many engineers or even product-led CEOs care so much about the product that they're so bought into this long-term vision of what they're building without actually testing it in the market to see, do people care about it? Is it solving the problem? Or it might be solving a problem, but just not the problem that you thought you were initially solving in the first place. So that ruthless prioritization coupled with building in an iterative fashion to make sure that you're not overbuilding before you're getting that user testing. And then also one thing that I found, and we're really lucky to have in our CTO, is the ability to truly understand the skill sets of the people that you need. Because if you start getting one type of engineer when you really need another, or a lot of people, they hear Silicon Valley buzz terms like AL, MI, or ML, AI, predictive, so they think they need a data scientist, so then you might spend a lot of resources on somebody that you need, but really you just need a data engineer that understands data because you're really not doing anything really amazing or comprehensive with the data. So truly understanding the people that you need, and then also really and truly understanding how to turn those business requirements into technical requirements. And so understanding what do the customers need and really understand from a scope and technical standpoint, what are you building to actually solve those? So every time we're thinking about building a new product, we do that, as well as a ton of user research. And to take that Steve Jobs analogy, you will never truly understand what customers need by asking them. And so it's this art and science where you have to use data and surveys and customer research to understand what they need, but then zoom out and say, okay, well, what are they really asking for? And then try to build that. Because a lot of the times customers don't even know what they need, but they'll try to explain it in the best way they can. So having that skill to be able to understand what are they saying, and then hearing it across multiple customers, zooming out, and then figuring out what's the common denominator around that ask or that request everyone is asking for, demanding, and then building something that can hopefully be great for as many customers as possible.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much, Bruce. Chris, maybe let's shift the same question over to you. And I'm curious from a prep standpoint, when it comes to build versus buy, for your company, that's something you may also be helping out with for your customers. And so, like, how do you help them make some of those decisions through a digital transformation?
Thank you. So a lot of my previous answer also still applies around certain subsystems, and generally speaking, you want to have a mindset which is open to buying things and being aware of what's in the market. I think Bruce talked a lot about customer development, or what Eric Ries or Steve Blank referred to as customer development, and trying to do good research and whatnot. And I think that varies a lot depending upon whether it's a B2C company or a B2B company. If it's a B2B company, then you're essentially arming salespeople to conduct interviews with potential buyers and trying to structure that feedback and bring it back to the product team. Where if it's a B2C company, you're actually trying to recruit users, run them through some kind of prototype, record it, hear their audio feedback, and really trying to learn as much as possible. So it really varies a lot in terms of the types of research that you can do before you even consider buying or building anything. And you may do that, before you do essentially a vendor search or a vendor review. You might do it earlier. On the B2C side and on the B2B side, I think prototyping is really important. So building an actual experience using something like Figma. We've used Figma over the years. We used to use InVision. Before that was Axure. So there's been tons of tools. There's probably hundreds of these tools to do some prototyping with end users and try to learn as much as possible. So I think that's a really important part of just trying to really learn what your end user and business problem ultimately is. And then as far as competitive analysis, or just vendor procurement, or good vendor research from a procurement perspective. I think what I mentioned earlier around timeline, budget, or functionality really matters in terms of what the other side is providing and how that morphs or squares up against the problem, solution, and the customer that you're trying to target.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. So we have a question from the audience that I think is pretty great. And so we're going to start here. Have you looked at the build, operate, and then transfer model with outsourced partners when you have the option to buy out the team in the future? Maybe Bill, you want to start there?
So absolutely, that's actually been something we've looked at multiple times over. And it really comes down to whether you're looking at the software or you're looking at the resourcing, what is the true need, and how valuable is the skill that you need to develop that solution to your IP. So the skill itself, is the skill IP, or is the solution really truly the IP? So having the architecture and the product owners, maybe that's the IP, and you look at specifically how deep you need to get into that. When we've looked at solutions, I think one of the things that we've had to really kind of dig into is the marketing speak versus the actual rubber meeting the road. Whether that's for a solution provider that we were looking at an end-to-end and potentially evaluating to eventually buy, or whether that was a software solution. The getting to the reality of what the team's capability is or the solution's capability is really critical, and sussing that out by doing appropriate testing, by all of the things that both Chris and Bruce pointed to in mock-ups and prototyping, and really seeing deliverables along the way from a team that you're evaluating as well, to the point where you can actually then make a decision on, is this something that I'm seeing enough value and I have to look at bringing them on? Is this something where it's a sustainable model for me to actually keep them as a partner that's more of a managed service, and they're delivering and I own the IP of what they do? I think it really comes down to all of those components.
Bruce or Chris, do you have anything you want to add?
So since we're a professional services firm, I think that's so build, operate, transfer, I think was a Deloitte thing or something that they really promoted. And I think the twist of that question is where you actually, the buyer of the service can actually buy the team, I think, after the delivery, which is really tricky for a professional services team. But there's certainly a number of companies that do that allow, after the project's done, to say, here's some of the people that worked on your team, and essentially move them over to be employees of the other side. It's not something that my company does, but I'm certainly familiar with the model, and I recognize that it has a huge advantage for the buyer of those services to do so.
Okay, we have another great question from the audience. So Chris, at what stage of growth should a business start building or buying a help desk and IT support team?
It's a tricky question. And I think it also matters whether it's like a B2B or B2C product, and sort of what the volume of those requests are. So many of those requests are actually critical product design and experience. It's just critical information. So at some point, you don't want that just sort of like relegated to a ticketing system where it just gets, a bunch of unstructured information slapped around it by IT support people. And then that's not bubbling up back to the product organization. So I think that has to be done extremely carefully. I think you do need a ticketing system of some kind, and you do need a good structured information management within that ticketing system, such that good feedback is bubbling back up to the top. And generally speaking, I would say to try to avoid it as long as possible, and try to add as much automation or semi-automation that you can into the process. So then you can manage it effectively in the early stages, get that product feedback back to the product team, and be able to iterate quickly. But at certain points, in certain companies that are large enough, this becomes unwieldy almost instantly. So I think the question's geared towards the earlier stage companies.
Okay, so let's shift a little bit to the topic specifically of buying a product. So once you've decided to buy a product, what do you feel like are the long poles, right? Could we potentially start with Bruce?
Yeah, so this is interesting and it's really top of mind for us right now. So as we've continued to grow the business, bring on more customers, actually related to the previous question about help desk or IT support, one of the things that's mission critical for us right now is making sure that we don't have a leaky bucket on the customer side. And so as we're bringing on new customers, making sure that we're not losing as many customers or having high churn. And so customer success, or CS is what everybody calls it, is extremely critical for us right now. And so right now, we actually did a build, if you will. And we say build in regards to spreadsheet because I still think that spreadsheet is a build in a way. And so we actually built out this really comprehensive spreadsheet to track when did a customer start, when did a customer sign an agreement, when did that customer actually get onboarded, when did they have their first touch point, what is their renewal date, because we wanted to understand what is our process. And now that we understand our process and we understand how do we want to manage the customers in the way that's the most effective for us to keep them for the long term, now we're starting to actually look at customer success products. And one of the most difficult parts to this is every department of a company in their tech stack, there's so many overlapping products that it's so difficult to figure out if there's one product that has additional modules or functionality that you should use for both, or should you have this really disconnected tech stack within that space? And so it's difficult as we're looking at a lot of customer success platforms, some of them don't have a knowledge base. So we're saying, well, do we need to get a knowledge base that also supports customer success, or do we need to get a customer success platform that has a knowledge base? Or do we get a separate knowledge base and a separate customer success platform, but then maybe that also doesn't have the ticketing in there. And so now all of a sudden it gets unwieldy and we have too many products. And so one of the things that we're trying to be cognizant about is there one product? Try to go into it up front, knowing that either we're going to use multiple products to cobble this thing together, or are we going to use or are we going to try to use one and just, as Bill was saying, just live with the limitations of what that one product offers.
That makes sense. Bill, do you want to weigh in there?
Absolutely. So I would point to two things as long poles. First is the contract component of things. So when you're buying, it really is critical to put enough effort up front on that implementation SOW. You have to actually really get to alignment with the partner that you're going to work with on what success looks like. And the work that you do up front will pay enormous dividends. So you should not shortchange that at all. The other piece that I would point to is that discovery, that first phase that you're going to work on in an implementation and buy, when you're going to evaluate gaps and you're going to, you've already decided the platform, you've already decided the partner you're going to work with, and you're in that discovery phase. You can't cut that short either. You have to put appropriate time there, and it tends to be one of the longer poles in the tent, because you have to get to the point where at the end of that discovery, you're validating the SOW that you've put in place. Are we at a place where we are going to deliver in the time, cost, and scope that we said we were going to? And you should get to that point at the end of that discovery. So I would say that those are the two pieces that I would say are both long poles and critical poles in the tent.
The other thing I think about a little bit is, frankly, at least from a larger enterprise standpoint, is security. So contract is probably at the top of my list, and then also security. Like, hey, to your point earlier, Bill, like, are there gaps? What gaps are there? How do we make sure you're not putting the organization at any additional risk?
Completely.
Kind of in that same vein. Bruce, anything else Chris, anything else you would add from a long pole standpoint for buying?
Yeah, those were both great answers. There's always gaps in terms of like what the functionality that the end user or the business wants, and then what the vendor is providing. So it's rarely a slam dunk. It's very oftentimes a compromise of something that's important. So I think trying to really focus on what that delta is. And then you might need to build something custom, or you might need to spend a lot of time with a specific integration to get that piece that maybe was in your early designs, maybe was in your RFP, but didn't make it into the finally selected purchased asset, whatever it may be. Another thing too, there's tons of optimists in this space. Salespeople, many of them are optimists, so they're everywhere, and you just have to be careful. I think skill really matters. If this is like a 7, 8, 9 digit deal, I think the stakes change pretty drastically. The Veterans Affairs Office has been buying Cerner for many years, and it'll probably be a decade, plus project when all is done. So I think there are very complex systems out there that are very hard to replace, even when you're buying. And I actually kind of agree with the Cerner decision for the VA, but that's a different story.
So question back to you, Chris, we have from the audience, is it worth outsourcing the build versus buy analysis and having that outsourcer help implement either as experienced or professional problem solvers?
So I'd say yes, there's certainly a caveat, and this goes into hiring a lot of professional services, whether it's a law firm or an accounting firm. That firm oftentimes is incentivized to send you proposals that have lots of work for them, right? So that's the challenge. So there is an inherent conflict of interest. So it's always best to have someone on essentially the ownership side of the business, a product leader or someone that is the person that's buying. So I think it's really hard when an executive is just outsourcing everything. I think you want to have someone internally that really understands what they're buying and can manage a portion of that process to also do so. So I just think that that's an important part. And it's certainly, there's a lot of reputable firms that are perfectly fine with that conflict of interest and manage it extremely well. So I think there's both sides of the coin, but that should be recognized as an important and tricky part of the notion of getting help and outsourcing it. There's also another angle, which is independent firms. You can certainly hire a management consulting firm to run that, and then there's sort of truly independent. There's product management firms that are, sort of a different segment of management consulting firms that just do product management. So, you could outsource to one of those. They would be more independent, and then you have someone that's, just a third party, an independent third party by design.
Bruce or Bill, feel free if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I'd love to add. I think Chris nailed it from my perspective. The pieces that I would say is you can't outsource the decision or the accountability. At the end of the day, your company owns the decision, your company owns the accountability. And as much as you can bring in a partner to help you, it is really your accountability at the end of the day. The piece that you can look at is maybe separating the two pieces, having the assessment done by one partner and the implementation done by another to kind of separate those concerns that Chris mentioned. So that would be the other piece that you can look at doing it that way.
Love it. So let's shift the conversation a little bit over to talent and build versus buy there. So how do you guys believe the Great Resignation has impacted the build versus buy conversation that we all constantly have? Bruce, maybe let's start with you.
Sure. So we're seeing this both internally at our own company, but then because we are always talking to HR leaders every day, we hear them all talking about how they're dealing with contractors versus gig workers, which sounds like contract, but it's more just project-based, or when people feel like working or putting their time and energy to a company, and then also figuring out what does that full-time look like. And as we're seeing more and more people, or companies rather, hire globally, then even just the status of how you talk about teams starts to change as well. And so from that team contract buy versus build perspective, it's really getting interesting, because on one hand, and I know my thinking has changed here, just having all these full-time people can sometimes feel great, and you know that you have people that are here for the long term and they understand your product, they understand everything that you're doing, they're bought into the vision, they'll put in that extra work and that grit and hustle to get stuff done. But then sometimes it might not just make sense for you to bring in somebody at that time. And it's just so much easier to just say, hey, here's a project, here's this thing that we just need to get over. We'll hire a firm and or a person. I think there's a lot to be said there, whether you want to hire a firm and then not necessarily know who on the firm or outsource firm you're working with versus actually hire a person. I think all of them could potentially work, but I think it all goes back to just understanding what you're doing and why you're doing it. Because I've seen success in failure with hiring people internally. Now the full cost of hiring someone internally with benefits and maybe options and all the things and the onboarding. If you're trying to get to market pretty quick and there's somebody that knows exactly what you need and they can get it done in a much faster way than onboarding somebody that might take 3 to 6 months, then maybe the outsourced model is the way. So I think all of them can work. You just have to be open and honest to yourself to understand what you're doing and what those implications are.
Bill or Chris, you want to add anything?
I feel like I'm still learning the impact of all this. So I'm not even sure I'm qualified to answer. Just so much going on with the teams shifting remotely, so many people leaving companies. There's just so many, and salaries have just gotten just have increased so significantly. I've certainly never seen it in my professional career. So there's just a lot going on right now. I think everything's moving slower. I hear that from a lot of people. And I think companies may have been more likely to outsource because they're having trouble hiring people. And then we just had this massive market correction that we're in the middle of that's been going on for a few weeks. And the Federal Reserve saying that they're going to raise interest rates the next 2 meetings and the next one's in I guess a week or something. So I just think we're in a very, very uncertain environment. So there's just a lot going on, and I'm not sure I can say any more than was already said.
It's totally fair. Bill?
So I would agree with everything Chris said. I think the macroeconomic forces that are driving the market right now are, really making the microeconomic decisions really hard to gauge and track. One of the things that I think we've seen really is, back to Bruce's point about the contractors, the gig economy, the project-based component. I think it's a stickiness factor for me. I think, whether it's staff or contractors or gig economy, what you want to make sure of when you're making a buy versus build on a resourcing level, it's about stickiness. How, if it's critical for you to retain that team, that resourcing, what is going to be the way that you're going to do that? Is it best to do it with a contract? And does that contractor, are those employees of that contractor, or are they 1099 or gig economy people that came on to specifically do that work? And I think what we've seen is specifically when we're talking about those gig economy type resourcing, they're a lot less sticky right now. They're moving around a lot more than the employees that are either employees of a contractor or your own employees. I think what I've seen personally is the gig economy workers are really hopping a lot more.
And I think to some extent, kind of the conversation around gig economy workers and what you've been talking about earlier, Bruce, goes back to total cost of ownership, right? Every decision you make ultimately helps drive, the amount that you will end up investing, regardless of build versus buy, and the length of that cost of ownership. So one of the questions from our audience is, what regions are you all looking at for outsourcing partners as India gets saturated? Bill, maybe let's start with you.
So we've expanded a lot into nearshoring in the Americas and Latin America, and we've had some good success with it. Again, we've been successful with it when the individuals have been employees of the contractors that we're working with versus they're brought on for a project-based contract that those have definitely been less sticky. And what we've seen in that case is a lot of global relocation. We've seen people with digital nomad type movement, moving to other countries and whatnot, and looking for those opportunities to do that. So if you're looking at outsourcing and you're looking at offshoring or nearshoring, that's one of the pieces that I would definitely look at is, the resourcing and the teams that you choose and the people that you're bringing on. What are they looking for? Are they happy where they are in the region that they're in, or are they ultimately looking to be mobile? And is that a part of what you're willing to do as an organization? And it's not right or wrong. But it should be critical to your decision.
Chris or Bruce, anything you want to weigh in? Okay, so then let's shift a little bit. Inherently, I have to ask, with all the collective experience at the table, when you look back at your company's build versus buy decisions, and you've learned through those experiences, is there anything you feel like you would go back and change through those decisions? Like, if you wish you wish you could change, kind of looking back on some of those harder conversations. Let's start with Chris.
Sure, I'll share one. So this was a long time ago. We've been around more than a decade, but we had a project where we just really underestimated the change management that was necessary to deploy the product. And there was a significant number of end users that had worked at this company for over a decade and had been very accustomed to the way things were. And we just really underestimated that entire change management plan, strategy, and process that was necessary. So that was a lesson, an important lesson to learn. I'm glad it was earlier in my career, but an important one that I really underestimated. So it just ultimately came down to underestimating a project.
Bruce, what about you?
I'll just answer quickly. This answer will be pretty short. As a startup, you have such limited resources. You typically don't even get the opportunity to have your engineering team build anything outside of your core IP in your product. And with the type of product that we're building, there haven't been too many solutions that we could have incorporated into the core IP of the product for us to have moved faster. So I think as we continue to grow, we'll probably have those types of decisions to make. But again, as a resource or constraint startup, we've had to be laser focused on making sure that our engineering resources are only going to the product versus building anything internally.
And Bill?
So I agree with both answers. I would add the sussing out truth versus fiction. I think especially when you're choosing either path, if you're doing a hybrid approach where you're having a partner do an implementation for you, really knowing their capabilities, really getting a deep understanding of what their capabilities are, and making sure that what you're signing up for is what you're getting. If you're choosing a solution, if you're buying a solution, it really is very much knowing the capabilities of that solution and not buying the marketing, because you get into some of the larger companies and they're really good at marketing that their solutions can do anything, and they even believe it a lot of the times. So I think it's really important to suss out what really will be real world for you, and that would be critical.
That's awesome to hear. With every buy versus build decision you make, even with every individual component of that, you have inherent risk, and kind of trading that off, understanding essentially, what risk you're accepting when you make that decision is really important. So to that effect, going down the buy path a little bit more, are there any non-negotiables for you all when it comes to buying? Are there things that you just, risks you just can't accept? Love to hear a little bit more about that. Bill, maybe let's start with you.
Absolutely. So for me, it starts with executive sponsorship, and you have to, especially a deal of any size, you have to have the appropriate engagement and sponsorship with the partner that you're going to work with. And if you don't, it is doomed to be a very difficult process of disagreeing and change management and change orders. That piece, along with the commitment to the solution and the resourcing, I think is the biggest non-negotiable for me. All of that fits to the partner taking accountability and really being engaged in the process, and not just being order taker, but having a seat at the table with you. Ultimately, as I said before, you can't outsource the decision, you can't outsource the accountability, but you can expect that the partners that you're going to work with, the platforms that you're going to choose, are partners to you and lean into that accountability and ownership with you.
That's great. Bruce, anything to add?
Just really quick here. The first thing I think about is buying product. And so as a company that just went through our first SOC 2 compliance in February, I believe, security is top of mind for everything that we do and all of our customers. And so price and customization and APIs and all of those things are negotiable, and we'll figure out what's the best for us, or if we can afford it in the first place, or what does it do, and what are the product gaps and feature gaps, and how does it work? But security for us at this point is non-negotiable.
Love it. How about you, Chris?
I just want to follow a bit what Bill said. Really agree with a lot of the points around executive sponsorship, and sort of a level down from that is just getting time of the necessary people in order to be successful. And if you have executive sponsorship, that's almost never a problem. And just being able to work with the right people in an organization, and some companies, we're a professional services firm. We've worked with over 100 companies at this point, and some companies that unfortunately don't have great cultures, and so sometimes consultants are brought into cultures that can be pretty toxic. And one thing that's really a non-negotiable for me, and it usually comes out in the first meeting, is just being respectful and being a willing collaborator and partner. And ultimately, we're all here to do good work, and it's no one has time for people that are going to be disrespectful. So that's also a non-negotiable.
Couldn't agree more. So I kind of go back to a little bit about what you mentioned earlier, Bruce, because it feels like sometimes our non-negotiables change and evolve over time based on the environment we're in. And one of the things that we've been talking about a lot at Vanguard is potentially APIs being a non-negotiable, and as part of kind of my role in the organization and our transformation to try and kind of move our organization forward. That's just been an interest of mine personally. So love that you mentioned it. Let's switch over, because I think there was a really good comment earlier from the audience around actually doing both, build and buy, and there's a space for that. Let's talk about that example. Have any of you done both simultaneously, or done kind of one after the other? And could you talk about that a little bit? Maybe Bruce, let's start with you.
Sure. So the example that comes to mind is around the data ingester that we have pulling in the data. And so we've built roughly 25 native integrations, and there's an unlimited number of HR systems out there. And so as we come across more and more companies that may be using either more niche HR systems or global HR systems, or just those that we just haven't prioritized or got to, then we always have to make this decision. Should we try to scramble to build another net new integration, or should we try to support or try to use some type of platform that may be some type of middleware where it will allow us to leverage their integrations? And we actually tried that, where we had all these native integrations, and then we also tried this middleware. But what we found is that the only reason why we tried to use them is because they were for the most difficult integrations, and they also hadn't really figured it out either. And so what we did is we just pulled it. It was like, you know what? We're not going to support them until we can put the dedicated time and resources to figure it out. It's not necessarily mission critical to the size of our market. Sure, it would be nice for us to be able to support those integrations, but again, we already have so many. It allows us to address a large enough portion of the market where it doesn't necessarily make sense for us to try to scramble and half-ass this integration over here. So for us, it was a really interesting learning lesson of knowing what we're good at, trying to leverage someone else to help us with the edge cases, and then just realizing that it was actually more trouble than the value that it provided. So we pulled back, and that was a learning lesson that we'll take moving forward in other areas of the business where we say, you know what, it just might not be worth it to try to use another platform for something that's so core to what we do versus then just waiting until we could do it ourselves.
Love it. What about you, Bill?
So I think hybrid works in two ways for us and for me in the course of my career. You know, whether that's evaluating, building, buying software, evaluating, building, buying teams, evaluating where to put those two pieces together, because you can build the software but outsource the team that builds the software. You can buy the software but outsource the team that does the support and management of the piece. So there's, I think, where does the IP sit has always been a key piece of a decision process there. So IP on the components that you're building, IP on the resourcing and the skill that's needed. And I think where we've been successful is when we really identify, you know, where the IP sits, where is their value add, where is it really just a, you know, a service offering is going to be the most beneficial. You know, if we pick a big platform, is it best to then understand that platform and manage it in-house and have that mix of buying the platform but managing it internally? Or is it best to, you know, just have a partner who knows it even better than we do? So all of that plays in, and we've done, you know, both where I am currently. I've done both in previous lives, and it really is trying to fit the pieces together in the right way. I think when it comes down to it.
Great to hear. Chris, if you have anything to add, go for it.
Yeah, I like what Bill also shared around the core IP side of things, and I'll just give an example of forms processing. So we've done over 200 projects. We built forms processing in so many different projects for a variety of reasons. We've also integrated other forms processing tools, and you know, it really depends if this is core IP or not. You might want to build it or you might want to outsource it. Other recent examples in the past year of where we've essentially bought things are for patient scheduling. There's a lot of tools that handle this very well. There's also healthcare interoperability software that's been around that really keeps up to date with all the different HL7 standards as they change. These are things that we've purchased as well.
And
Awesome.
if I could add just one thing, because I agree with everything Chris just said. I think there's nuance as well that I was just thinking about. You know, even if you decide to do the outsourcing or hybrid model, it can be a hybrid of a hybrid. So some of the team might be internal, some of the team might be outside. So I agree with everything Chris just said.
Awesome. Let's switch to a question from the audience. So it's a little bit long, bear with me, give me 1 second. So given that the tech companies are laying off, funding is slowing down, valuations are becoming realistic versus the last 18 months, and yes, the Great Resignation, but it's not all rainbows long-term for the people leaving those companies. Do you think this will actually help early stage companies that have been looked over due to the so-called rock star startups that have imploded? Maybe let's start with Chris. Feel free to let me know if you want me to read through again.
I think the answer is yes. I think generally speaking, it's really hard to build a venture capital backed company and return the multiples to shareholders and investors that are needed. And so it just begets a lot of behavior that's not exactly human centered, let's say. So I do think that we're going to see through this correction, I think a lot of positive things for people, particularly, and also for companies that have real cash flow and have real businesses with solid balance sheets. I think those are going to prevail, and I think less companies that are not solvent making noise is certainly a good thing. So I think generally it's a needed correction.
Bruce, anything you want to weigh in?
Yes, I'm going to answer this with maybe, and it depends. And I'll take a little bit of a different perspective than Chris. What we're seeing, especially at our stage and with the data that we're seeing from compensation that we have from our customers, is that we're in this really interesting labor economy where you have tons of layoffs, but you still have a lot of people demanding the highest salaries that they've ever had. And so the way that I like to think about this is, sure, there are offices that are opening where you can go back, but because everybody was stuck in the house for almost 2 years, it's really hard to go back, even if the offices are open. Excuse me. And so I feel like it's the same way when you're talking about rock stars, even though there's a correction in the space, until people are forced and the companies say absolutely no or laugh them out the room after they give them a job offer, until people start feeling that, the rock stars, and let's just define rock stars as the best talent out there, who also knows they're the best talent, are still going to command the highest wages possible, just because the cat is already out the bag. And for the person who answered the question or asked the question, I like to define rock stars in two different categories. Rock stars that don't necessarily know they're rock stars yet, or rock stars in the making, versus people who already know they're rock stars and know their value, because those are two totally different people. Rock stars in the making could be someone who was a certain level at a larger company, and then they can come in and run your whole division because they have the skill sets and they've been on the management track and they understand what your company needs. So they can come in and be a total rock star for you, even though they may have not been at some really bright, shiny, crazy VC-backed company that raised hundreds of millions of dollars. But then there are also people who are already rock stars and have been told they're rock stars 100 times. And the companies that they worked at, it's like, well, I'm a rock star. I worked at Facebook, or I'm a rock star. I worked at Stripe. And so you not only have that they've been told they're a rock star, they know they're a rock star, and the company has given them the stamp to tell the market that they're a rock star. That person is still going to want to command the highest salary possible. And so I think you have to suss out which person are you talking to, because you will be hit with that rude awakening very quickly if you think you're going to get the best person at this larger company for a cheaper price.
Love it. Bill, anything you want to add?
So I would say that I think there's still more correction, leveling out that needs to happen. So, and I love the rock stars in the making that Bruce just went through. I think those are the areas that you can buy value right now. So I agree with that 100%.
Awesome to hear. So I will say this is probably the last question on my part, and it's mostly around the build, because we've done a lot of talking about buying. What do you all feel are the longest poles to building? And I know we talked a little bit about some of that prep work, some of the defining your problem statement, but once you actually decide you're going to build, what do you think kind of drives that timeline the most? Maybe let's start with Bill.
So I think it's stakeholder alignment. So we use the term common understanding, and it's not just common understanding of requirements, it's common understanding of the solution. It's from the business problem that you're solving through the solution that you deliver. Getting that alignment is the longest pole in the tent, and it runs the whole length of the project that you're going to do to build out your solution. It is the one factor that I would say, if you don't get that, you will fail.
Chris, anything you want to add?
I agree with that. Key to alignment, I feel like some of the tooling for alignment, certainly morphs over time. One of the areas that we put a lot of emphasis on is just prototyping, and at the very earliest stages, trying to do as much prototyping as possible, trying to test if it's a B2B product or B2C product, as I was describing earlier, trying to do as much testing as possible, getting as much validation from that prototype as possible, and as much learning back to the product team, so then you can try to redesign something that's going to be effective, and then deciding whether or not you want to run another study essentially, or you're ready to actually build the product. I feel like so many projects go wrong at that sort of early part of the process, and it's where we put a lot of emphasis.
And then last but certainly not least, Bruce, long poles in buying, or sorry, long poles in building.
My answer to this is no, if you have enough conviction to think of this with the end in mind versus this is something that we're going to test and prototype. Because if some people think that we already have an end in mind and over the next 6 months or 12 months, we're going to have this thing, and then marketing and sales and everybody's super excited about it, especially your non-technical people. But the tech team thought, well, actually, no, we never said that we were going to have this done within this period of time. It's more, this was always iterative, and we knew that we were going to test and figure things out. So some of the features that we talked about, we're not even going to have because we still would need to test. I think that's super important. So know if for the long haul or the long term, this is, you have enough conviction where you're just going to try to bang this out and build, or if this is something where we're going to build and test. And whatever we said we were going to build 3 months ago could totally change because we're still trying to prove out our thesis.
Awesome. Great to hear. So we're just about at time. And what I want to kind of close out with is how much support you guys have all gotten in the chat itself. So if you haven't gotten a chance to read through as we've been talking, I certainly encourage you to do so. We have, people saying great session. Thank you for kind of calling out some of these great ideas. We have topics around rock stars, topics around SOC 2, all really, really exciting. So thank you so much.